I'm very pleased to welcome our first keynote speaker. He's someone that many of you may have heard present previously. It's Andreas Faludi, who's Professor Emeritus of Spatial Policy Systems in Europe from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And his keynote is entitled The Poverty of Territorialism. So Andreas, if I can ask you to go to the podium and give him a warm welcome, please.
Well, let me start by saying I'm very intimidated by this immediate polling and so forth and so forth. I am an advisor on one of the ESPON projects. It's actually the project that prepares the evidence base for the new territorial agenda. And I couldn't attend the second meeting, so I sent a note and I reminded the participants of the project in that note that the institutional framework in which the territorial agenda is going to be produced was also very important. And this may have been a critical note. Anyhow, I was invited to give the keynote speech here. Well, my keynote speech is, of course, based on a book that I was at that time in the process of preparing, and which I held in my hands only 1 week ago, and some folders should be on display here, and it's called The Poverty of Territorialism, with a subtitle. But first of all, the message, and now this is sort of the first part. Yes, it works. I have 3 more messages before I really start with the presentation. One is that space is not a set of containers. Territorialism essentially conceptualizes space as a set of containers. The second message is that control over space must be shared. We can no longer, because we don't live in containers anymore, we can no longer control each container separately. And my third message is very much inspired by the notion of soft spaces. We must strive towards soft planning for soft spaces. Not the hard planning that takes place within jurisdictions, but a different type of planning. But this is just warming up. Now the content. There will be preliminaries which I want to go through. I will tell you a little bit more about what territorialism really stands for, to my mind, in relationship to another concept of historicism. I will then, first of all, make the case for territorialism. Before you criticize something, you must try and present it in as good a light as possible. That's what I'm trying to do. Then I will relate territorialism to the EU crisis that we are going through, and I will give you an alternative. And this alternative I call neo-medieval, which is meant to be provocative, but it's also based on some solid analysis, not by myself, but by other authors. And I will say something about what neo-medieval planning could and should be like. And if you discover then that it's very much like the current practice, then you are spot on. And finally, I will make concluding comments. So that's what we are going to do today. And I start with the preliminaries. I feel I need to tell you how I became critical. I have been engaged for 20 years now in following European spatial planning, starting, of course, with the European spatial development perspective, which I became aware of in the mid-1990s, and I did a book on the making of the European spatial development perspective, No Master Plan. And I was optimistic, and I continue to be optimistic, searching out opportunities for how to improve European spatial planning, and often I got disappointed. And in the course of doing this, I was beginning to explore what is Europe, actually. I'm an amateur in these respects. And of course, when I speak about Europe, I mean the EU. I mean, I make this mistake, which many people do make, but okay, I mean the EU. And I also discovered that the EU has enemies. And you may figure out who they are. And I explored every new move made by the enthusiasts to engender some kind of European planning to make it possible, and published on that. Yet I continue to be disappointed. And I started studying two concepts which are in everybody's mind when discussing things European, and in particular European regional and cohesion policy. One is subsidiarity. Of course, we're all for subsidiarity. Yeah? I mean, well, I looked into what subsidiarity actually means in the treaties. And in a treaties, it only refers to the exercise of shared competences. That's what subsidiarity means in the treaty. I mean, we have, of course, general concepts of subsidiarity, but in the treaty, it applies to how to decide whether or not to apply a shared competence. Now, territorial cohesion is one such shared competence, and once it appeared in the treaty, in the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, the Commission published a green paper on territorial cohesion, and a lot of the reactions to that paper were to propose that this green paper should be followed by a white paper, and the white paper should be followed by legislative proposals, and so forth and so forth. But two countries, Germany and the United Kingdom, were opposed on grounds of subsidiarity. They were claiming that they could do this much better in an intergovernmental way than before. And as a result of that, there has never been a white paper and never been a legislative proposal. This is how subsidiarity works actually in the context of the treaties. Yes? And I analyzed this concept of subsidiarity for the underlying assumptions. The underlying assumptions were, one of the key assumptions underlying is that in this context, the member states are the first to decide. The member states are the first to decide what's good for their territory and their people. And this is what I labeled territorialism. I did the same with multi-level governance. Multi-level governance is a concept which came up in, actually it was an American, a young American, Gary Marks, who came to, he was actually sent to Europe to study European, EU, at that time, European Community, regional policy. And he discovered that this was something that concerned several levels of government. In particular, of course, the European Commission, which initiated it, and the regions, and in between the member states. And he studied the actual processes and found a very messy process, which he called multi-level governance. He coined that term. And the point is that he found that the process was very messy. And he, for instance, in the first article which he wrote about this, he said this does not conform to the Weberian notion of the state, the notion of a state that exercises control over its territory and has the monopoly on the use of power. That's the concept of the state. And again, the concept of the state underlying is territorial, but multi-level governance questions that concept because it reaches across levels. I also found that the same Gary Marks, who subsequently liaised with, in the literal sense of the word, they got married, with Lisbeth Hoche, and wrote a number of books on multi-level governance, and they defined multi-level governance type 1, which is the hierarchical one, yes, and multi-level governance type 2, which is the involvement of functional authorities and the action groups and so forth. So there are two types of multi-level governance, in fact, in the literature. And we always look at one type, which is the vertical one, the relationship between levels of government. But we forget this very important part, the overlapping and messy relationship between functional regions on the one hand and territorial governments on the other. And actually, in their book, they draw attention to the fact already, without calling it neo-medievalism, that this resembled pre-modern arrangements. Yeah? So these were sources of inspiration to me. And I began to focus on this concept of sovereignty and also on the concept of representative democracy, because what is the very strong argument for maintaining territorialism is that it's the framework for the exercise of democratic rights, for what I call the production of democratic legitimacy. Let me say that straight away. Yeah? But all this led me to formulate the concept of territorialism. Okay. First of all, let me talk, before we go and discuss territorialism, about space as an object, because that, again, is subject to misunderstanding. But this is, I chose the Federal Republic of Germany. This is administrative space. Federal Republic of Germany divided into 16 Länder. This is the same Federal Republic of Germany, and it's based on a federal spatial vision published in 2005, and it's a different concept of space that is reflected here. It's a more functional space. The borders disappear, and even the national borders are being transgressed, because functional space these days transgresses national borders. Yeah? Second one, which relates to the first one. So we distinguish an administrative space, which is very important for land use planning, it's important for public works, and it's really multi-level in a vertical sense. So it happens on municipal level, on regional level, national level, and there is the EU territory. But it's about pursuing the policies of public administrations. This is one notion of space. Yeah? But there's a second one, place. I mean, you mentioned the term place. It gained prominence through the work of Fabrizio Barca, who is, I'm glad to say, is also involved in the project that I was talking about initially. Or we are talking about locations, about ensembles. And this notion of space is characterized by the soft borders that surround it. Yeah? It takes networks into account. It's about overcoming borders. But the relationship between these two notions of space and of the institutions involved is a powder keg. I mean, here we are up against a problem. Now, let me talk about historicism and territorialism itself. My source of inspiration has been Karl Popper, his book, The Poverty of Historicism, published in 1956. And basically, he criticizes historicism for being wrong on methodological grounds. Historicism stands for the idea that the social sciences are about predicting the course of development. And if we think about it, that's what we would like to do, like to have, knowing how social development will continue, because the future is a challenge. Now, Popper says this cannot be done. He has various methodological reasons for it, which I don't want to go into. Yeah? But this book has been the inspiration for me, or at least the title of the book, to write this book on the poverty of territorialism. Because, again, I think that territorialism in the present day and age cannot work either. It is wrong on methodological and practical grounds. Let us look at one of the chief rationales for planning. It is that land is a scarce resource. Therefore, we say we must plan the land. We must allocate land to the best uses. But this is relative. There may be land outside the borders which we could use. No problem. Oh, the problem is that there's a border. Yeah? So that's one reason why this territorialism is a problematic basic assumption. And the second one is that in planning something, anything that is close to any border, and everything is close to a border these days, you must take account of cross-border effects, both inwards effects and the effects which that particular development has outside the border. Yeah? So these are reasons why planning under territorialism cannot work either. Why good planning should define its own space, should define what is relevant to that particular issue, irrespective of borders. Let me go somewhat more deeply into the concept itself. The concept of territory is, of course, basic to territorialism. And I get this out of the book Le Développement Territorial en Europe, French author, Baudel. And he describes territory as being characterized by, one, there being a sovereign. Yeah? Territory is not just any piece of land. It's a piece of land that is governed by a sovereign. Secondly, that sovereign can and must exercise control over that territory. If a state that pretends to be a state but does not control a territory is not recognized under international law. And the third element of a territory is that it has borders. So borders are very, very important to territorialism. And if you start overcoming borders, you are challenging territorialism. Now, what is then based on this territorialism? A more concise definition, the one that I got out of the literature. It's macro social space organized in districts, towns, provinces, countries, and regions. This is so familiar to us that we do not question it. But it's an artificial construct. It's not given by nature. It is related to our institutional setup. It's a meta-geography, a spatial structure of thought. Thought. The T is missing, I'm sorry. So that's a concept. Now, it is intimately related to what's called territoriality in the literature. What's that? Well, according to Robert Sack, an American author, written fairly early in 1986 already, territoriality is the attempt to affect, influence, or control people, phenomena, and relationships by determining an asserted control over a geographic area, and that happens at the border. It's by definition related to territorialism. And map making and surveying is an absolutely essential element of territorialism. Before I explain what this gentleman is, who this gentleman is, in the late 17th and early 18th century, the French kings decided to have a map drawn of their country. Now, this was only possible because the art of surveying had been developed and almost invented by the Cassini family, Italian family. And they drew a map, and it took decades and decades. And this was seen as so challenging by inhabitants of the Haute-Loire that they actually killed the surveyor. Because it intimated to them, hey, that the king is going to control our country. But the first map, this Cassini map, is the first map ever drawn by a nation state. It wasn't, I mean, it became the nation state of France, by France, of its own territory. It's something, again, completely natural to us. Yes? We all have maps, but it was an invention. And it was based on a technology of map making. Now, how important is map making? In the I don't remember how many years ago, it must be 15, 20 years ago, high up in the Alps, a body was found. It was in the Italian-Austrian border region, and out of the glacier came a Neolithic man, known as the Iceman or Ötzi. And the discovery was a world sensation, and then they were actually analyzing the map. So where does this body lie? And based on this information, he was a few meters within the Italian territory across the Austrian border. It was decided that this was an Italian. And so the Iceman is now on display in Bolzano, which sometimes is also called Bozen. And I was trying to go there the summer before last. Impossible. I mean, if you don't have an electronic ticket, no way. And this is a reconstruction of the Iceman, just to illustrate the importance of borders. Yeah? I'm critical of territorialism, you have understood that much, because I'm talking about its poverty. But Popper has taught me to make the case for whatever you criticize first. Make it as good a case as possible. And one case is, one argument is that territorialism and territoriality is common to animals and humans. Yeah? That it's a natural thing. And yes, I had fish in a tank as a boy, and some of the fish settled in the corner of the tank and defended that corner, even against larger fish, and attacked them. But there were other fish, so-called swarm fish, that didn't care about territorialism. But still, I mean, humans may also be regarded as territorial. There's this saying of my home is my castle, and it expresses important feelings of belonging and identity, and I recognize this. Nothing wrong with it. And this territoriality, or territorialism, has become a principle of social organization, the meta-geography that we've called before. You probably wouldn't even think about Europe in any different way as a collection of member states. Not only member states, but in this case, states. This seems absolutely natural to us. It's the dominant principle of social organization, not just of land, but it's also a principle of international law. It's basic to our intercourses across borders. But there are alternatives which we don't think about. A very talented student from Dortmund University did a master thesis, and he suggested to divide Europe by water catchment areas. Hey, no, there isn't an alternative. It makes sense. It makes so much sense that the European Union requires the water management to divide it by water catchment areas. There are real functional areas related to this kind of Europe. It's an unusual kind of Europe, Hydropa, he called it, but it makes sense, and it is next to the other type of Europe, the territorialist type of Europe that we know and that we think is a natural given, that we should not really meddle with. Yeah, and yes, this gives us security, emotional satisfaction. You proudly announce that you are, hey, what am I actually? I mean, I was born in Hungary, brought up in this country, went to the UK, and now I'm a Dutch citizen. There you are. I mean, but anyway, but it gives you emotional satisfaction. Yes, that is certainly true. I love Delft, which is where I live. I've been living for 43 years. But I also love Vienna. I mean, I still know the city reasonably well, at least those parts which existed 50 years ago. And yes, importantly, it's also a basis for solidarity. We are willing up to a point to pay taxes to support other people in your own country. But when it comes to supporting people in other countries, it gets a little bit problematic. Yeah? So, I mean, there are very real advantages which make the case for territorialism. And states are, of course, the epitomes of territorialism. Yeah? It's all about states, the organization of the world into states. Yeah? Now, let us look at the EU, which is really what we're talking about when talking about ESPON. I know it's the EU plus 32 members. Yeah? What we see now in the EU is a reassertion of territorialism. For a while, it seemed like the end of territorialism, almost. But no, we now see a massive reassertion of it. We see it around immigration, we see it around the Schengen area, or at least the procedures of Schengen and Dublin, all these catchwords for controlling migration generally. And of course there's Brexit and so forth, yes. And so as something new, I asked students in my class whether they had to show their passport in crossing borders. Some of them coming from outside the EU. They asked, no, what are you talking about? Of course, yes, but within the EU it's of course less usual these days, except if you cross from Austria into Bavaria. Every morning on Bavarian radio, together with the traffic announcements, they say the waiting time has been 20 minutes and 30 minutes at this particular border point and that particular one. I discovered that if you took a sleeping car and put your car on a sleeping car, you were not controlled. But unfortunately, they've abolished the sleeping car from Vienna to Düsseldorf. So, but this all relates, of course, to a fundamental question. And the fundamental question is about the nature of the EU. What is it? Yeah? Is it supranational? Yeah, that's one theory of the EU. Is it the federal states of Europe? The F word, as they say in English. In which case, of course, we would look at least the whole of Europe as one territory, and the borders would recede into the background, if not disappear. So that's one notion of, and this was the initial idea of many of the proponents of European integration, and it was what created enthusiasm. Or is it an intergovernmental organization, one that is at the mercy of the member states? Or is it something new, something we don't know about, something sui generis? There are some authors who propose this, say, look, we really don't know what it is, which is sui generis actually means. Yes? And I tend to side with those. But it may also wither away. I mean, this is now, and interestingly, there don't seem to be any theories of the decline and disappearance of the EU. And there's also something called integration Mark II, new types of integration. World cities are integrating, yes? They are establishing networks. There are functional regions. There are non-governmental organizations, which is a different type of integration, and it's lively. It goes on, irrespective of the EU crisis. Yeah? Now, what's this new medieval alternative? Well, it's not back to the Middle Ages, please. Yes, I mean, that's not what I mean. Not that I know what spatial planning in the Middle Ages was like. I mean, actually, at one meeting a few years ago with an audience of academics, I said that I'm offering a prize, tongue-in-cheek, for whoever tells me how planning in the Middle Ages was like. Yeah? I suppose it had something to do with monasteries and the planting of monasteries. Yeah? So not back to the Middle Ages, but taking certain structural features of the Middle Ages as a model. Now, I really want to walk you through this diagram. And it is the EU, but it is what the EU really is. Yeah? So there are 17 countries that belong to all parts of the EU. Everything. Schengen, the European Economic Area, the Customs Union, and of course the Euro. 17 countries. So these are the, if you want, if you think about the EU as a federal state proper, that is the core EU. And all the other countries do not participate in one or more of the institutions of the EU. And so you have Sweden, Hungary, Czechia, Poland, Denmark, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, and the UK. They do not have the euro for various reasons. Some of them might in future. Some of them will never because they have an opt-out. Some of them do not have an opt-out but do not take the euro anyhow, like Sweden. Sweden is in violation of the treaty, but okay. Then there is, of course, Cyprus and Ireland, which for different reasons are not part of the Schengen area. Then, of course, observe that the European Free Trade Association includes Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, 3 of which are also in the customs union, and Switzerland is not in the customs union. It is in Schengen, but not in the customs union. So if you enter Switzerland, you may be stopped. You don't have to show your passport, but if you carry goods, you may have to pay customs duty getting into Switzerland. And then there is, of course, the case of Turkey, which is not Europe, but it's in the Europe Customs Union. And it, I mean, at the moment, it's still a candidate country. So, yeah, it's really a complex thing. And it reminds me of the Middle Ages, of various overlapping areas. Yes? And the implication of thinking about the neo-medieval alternative is that sovereignty and democracy must become less prominent, that global cities and functional regions are and will be gaining in importance. And this is, again, a fact. I mean, this is the literature Saskia Sassen, for instance, writes about, and Susan Feinstein writes about global cities. Yes? The neo-medieval alternative is about pursuing interdependence, whatever it takes. That's Draghi, of course, but I'm quoting Draghi here, not in a different context. Yes? And it is something that is seriously being thought about and written about. It's not my invention. This is Jan Zielonka, who published 3 books. Jan Zielonka is from Poland. He has a Dutch passport and is a professor of European studies at Oxford University. And he has written a book about Europe as empire in 2007, where he was reflecting about the failure of the European Constitution to get accepted. And he said, well, Europe is not a federal state at all, it's an empire. And empire has a bad name, but actually authors who study empire have some positive things to say about empire, which I don't want to go into. Yeah? So he wrote a book about Europe as empire. Then he wrote this book in 2014 about, is the EU doomed? And he says, yes, the EU may very well be doomed, but this is not all bad news for European integration. So he clearly has a different form of European integration in mind. Yeah? And it's a neo-medieval form of integration. And he says that abandoning ever closer union, which is of course in the preamble of the European Treaty, is or would be a Copernican revolution for thinking about European integration. Anyhow, he says the status quo is no option. Now, what would neo-medieval planning be like? Well, first of all, it would and should abandon the mad chase for integration within closed territories, which is what planning seems to be about in the first instance, because planners in the first instance are concerned with territories. They serve their political masters. They form part of what I, with an angry word, sometimes describe as a territorial administrative complex. Different story. Neo-medieval planning is already upon us. I chose deliberately this diagram depicting Austria and Hungary and all the cross-border projects, cross-border cooperation programs taking place in and around these 2 countries, thanks to the Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontalière, which produced this and many other very instructive diagrams. Okay, the borders are still drawn in black, so you can see them, but this is actually about cross-border planning, overlapping cross-border planning initiatives, promoted by the European Union through its program of territorial cooperation, European territorial cooperation. Actually, I always think that this has been invented in order to obviate the role of borders, in order to reduce the role of borders. The European Union is very crafty in creating these kinds of programs which question the power of nation states. Yes? They are conflated spaces, a young, very talented Austrian said in her PhD, Eva Burkhardt-Hofer. This leads to ever more complex configurations. This is a quote from an analysis not so much of European planning, but of planning in the northwest of the United Kingdom, where this author, who is, again, a young and up-and-coming author, John Harrison, he said, well, on the one hand, there are plans, of course, for administrative areas, but the real planning is for overlapping functional places, and the two form very complex arrangements. Yes? Or in EU policies are addressing spatial configurations cross-cutting local, regional, and national boundaries. I took this one, it's not the latest Interreg transnational cooperation area, but it's as a map, it's very good. It's Interreg Mark IV, and you see there are some areas which are part of 3 different transnational cooperation areas, north of Scotland, for instance. Even Austria, too. Austria participates in I think it's 3 of these areas. So the upshot of that is not only that it becomes messy, but also that some potential partners in these areas have the choice of applying it to 3 different for 3 different sources of funds. Now, having said all this, I now want to talk about narratives or metaphors or storylines, because narratives require storylines which influence and structure your thinking. And these are metaphors for European integration and the role of states, which is what we have been talking about. And the first metaphor is to look at states and Europe totally differently. Usually we look at Europe as a map depicting all the member states, and they are contiguous. Well, try and figure each member state as an island, and these islands forming an archipelago. That's one of my spatial metaphors for thinking about the EU. First of all, it means normally if you live on an island, if you say to somebody, you don't live on an island, you mean to criticize his or her isolationism. But islands, certainly first of all, islands are not like that. Islands get strong by exploring and exploiting their relationship with the sea. That's what islands do, and some do it exceedingly well, and others maybe less so, but that's much more their purpose and their opportunity than isolating itself from the rest. Secondly, I'm not talking about individual islands, I'm talking about an archipelago of islands. And this archipelago of islands, as any archipelago, the islands hang together by their relationships over the sea, fishing, exploiting the sea, traveling, and so forth and so forth. Yeah? So think about Europe as such an archipelago of islands where relations are of equal importance to controlling your land surface. That's my message. It's beyond territorialism. It surpasses territorialism. Yeah? My second metaphor related to this one, they are not mutually exclusive, is think about states as ice floats. Ice floats change. Ice floats submerge sometimes. Ice floats change their shape. They can also coalesce depending on the currents and so forth and so forth. States as ice floats, states changing. Well, in my living memory, a lot of states have changed, yes? Just talking about Austria, Austria re-emerged in 1945, as you know. I mean, I came to Austria in 1946, but it wasn't a country, it was subdivided into 5 occupation zones. Why 5? There were 4 allies, but the first district of Vienna was actually under international regime, and so therefore they changed. There was a changing of the guards every month. North of, and Austria was of course right on the border, the Iron Curtain and all that. Yeah? North of Austria was a country called Czechoslovakia, and you know what happened to that. And south of the country was a relatively peaceful neighborhood. It was peaceful and open, Yugoslavia. Yeah? And I traveled to Yugoslavia. Actually, I took busloads of tourists to Yugoslavia as a guide and back again. Look at what happened to that country. 3 Baltic states. Yeah? I mean, yes, I was interested in history, so I knew that there were Baltic states at some stage, but they were, for us, they were behind the Iron Curtain, and so forth. And I mean, the message I hope comes across. States are like ice floats, historically. And if you look at the maps, political maps, this is absolutely evident. The farther back you go, the more evident it is, and you come into neo-medieval or pre-modern centuries where maps looked very different. Yeah? My last one. Think about Europe as a cloud. A cloud of, in this case, cooperation areas. This is a map from 2007. The map at presently would look very different, but it gets the message across. Europe, as it really is a huge cloud of different institutions, different types of cooperation in which we move around, and it's complicated, yes? It doesn't have a particular shape. This is why I call it a cloud. Yeah? The other one, which illustrates the same thing as this one, which really is the same as the previous one, it shows you the various meanings of Europe and European integration. In this particular case, it includes the Council of Europe, which, as you know, reaches to Vladivostok, because the whole of the Russian Federation is part of the Council of Europe, and it does include Turkey. I mean, there's only one European country which is not included, which is Belarus. But it also shows something else. The mini-states. We sometimes forget about the mini-states. Yes? Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, and Vatican. The first 3 are somehow related to the EU on the treaties. Vatican is not related to the EU in any way, except for one. They coin Eurocoins, which is good business. And they do this under a treaty. But there are 2 other countries which also use the euro without having asked permission from anybody, which is Montenegro and Kosovo. While Kosovo may have been under the tutelage of the EU, but it's not part of the Eurozone, but it is. So Europe as a cloud, and if you want to handle Europe, if you want to discuss European integration, you are dealing with a cloud. Here I'm giving you a quote from Bertrand Russell, Sir Bertrand Russell. It's a quote from 1949, and just read it. I think the universe is all spots and jumps, without unity, without continuity, without coherence and orderliness, or any other properties that governnesses love. Indeed, there is little but prejudice and habit to be said for the view that there is a world at all. I mean, he's talking about quantum physics and things like that, which I don't understand. Physicians have recently advanced opinions which should have led them to agree with the foregoing remarks, but they have been so pained by the conclusions to which logic would have led them that they have been abandoning logic for theology in shoals. Wonderful English expression. This is my concluding comment, and it points to a basic question that looms up in our minds. If this is true, how about the future? In particular, how about the production of democratic legitimacy in a neo-medieval world? I mean, neo-medieval implies that the containers, which are the building blocks of territorialism, are no longer the exclusive frame within which to hold elections. This is what is implied. We need to rebuild our institution, including our democratic institutions, to fit the world as it is. Students on Monday have asked me, so what's the alternative? What's your message? Well, I said, I don't have one. I don't know what the future will bring. I give you an historic example. Democracy and the nation states, as we know them, they emerged after the French Revolution, after the people took over the role of the king. And that's what the revolution was about. Yeah? And now it became important to know who are the people, where are the people. So borders became even more important. Yeah? And how can the people express their will? And these are basic assumptions behind democracy. And it took 50 years before they hit upon the idea of general elections. And just to backtrack into the 17th century, when the luminaries were discussing, and revolutionaries they really were discussing the nature of the political system. We're beginning to develop an opposition to the king and his rule, and opposition to the church, and opposition to God. Yeah? These were the topics that were discussed in the circles of Diderot. Did they know about what the future will bring? No. They couldn't know it. They were just criticizing. And that's what, at the moment, I'm afraid I can do. I can criticize territorialism and the underlying assumptions, also the underlying of planning. But I cannot tell you what the future will bring, except that I suspect it will be neo-medieval. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. If you can come and take a seat. Sorry? Yeah, all good, thank you. So while you've been speaking there, I've seen that there are a number of questions which have been coming in on the Slido app and have been highly or ranked up. Maybe some of these people are in the audience, or indeed some of them are perhaps even watching the live stream. The one which is a topic which was raised by a number of different people, the first one which is highlighted there: how do we avoid an erosion of democratic legitimacy, space as a political container, if we increasingly move to fluid/soft territorial governance of space? Now, there were variants of that sort of question, and you touched upon it to a certain extent in your conclusion there. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Is it on? Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, as you were saying, John, I touched upon this already by saying I don't know. I mean, but first of all, let us establish that the framing of the production of democratic legitimacy by territories is presently problematic, to say the least. Yes? It doesn't take account of interrelations. Yes? I give you an example from the Netherlands, yes, because it would be invidious to talk about our host country. In the Netherlands, there was a referendum about whether or not the Dutch government should sign the association treaty with Ukraine. Now, that was a referendum held within the Netherlands, and there was a precondition under the law that at least 30% of the population had to cast their vote. So in the end, I think 32% cast their vote, and the majority of those, about 60%, were against the Dutch government signing the association treaty with Ukraine. It was a very democratic procedure. It's involving the people directly, but it obviously did not take account of what not signing the association treaty might mean for Ukraine. And it did not take account of the fact that the other 27 member states of the EU were intending to sign the association treaty. Now, I'm not going to go through what happened afterwards, because I didn't even follow it. It was an extremely muddled procedure afterwards. But this was democracy pure and simple. Yeah? But it did not, it disregarded, to my mind, that's my opinion, it disregarded many of the aspects of an association treaty with Ukraine. So, yeah, I have problems with the production of democratic legitimacy as it is.
Okay, thank you very much. There's also the third question, which is up on the slide there. Is there anything? Oh no, then the questions are now moving around. It's now second on the slide. Is there anything? Could there be any benefits of a European federal state to address that, or ultimately to address emerging geographies and territorial development policies? Is there anything you could add on that? Maybe you've covered it partly already.
No, I didn't. I don't think I did, but I mean, obviously there would be advantages to having European integration proper. Yeah? And if it had happened to a significant extent, in particular in the field of planning, I would not be as critical as I am. Why would there be advantages? Well, because the territory is larger, yes, and the EU encompasses more functional relationships than the member states. It's really as plain as that. But it doesn't encompass all. Yeah? I mean, there are obvious relationships between Europe and the rest of the world, which I believe, and indeed I know, has also been one of the ESPON projects, Europe in the World, and it shows that there are massive relationships across the so-called external borders. My criticism of territorialism in principle also applies to the idea of a European federal state. But it would be less problematic than the current situation of 28 member states trying to govern their own territory is.
Right, and one final one from the app, and this is my the power I have as the moderator. I don't have to go for the most popular outcome or the most popular question. I can choose one from further down. There's an interesting question I see that has only 2 votes currently because it only just came in. It says, populists win with simple stories. How can we ensure that people have a feeling, a real base of safety and co-decision in the complex neo-medieval world you describe?
Well, first of all, yes, the diagnosis is correct. Yes. How could we? Well, education, demonstration. Also, I suppose you will be talking about this. Reducing inequality, reducing the anger which really exists. Yes, and the anger with the elites. I mean, we see on television now the Gilets jaunes. But before that, there have been many such expressions of resentment, which is then being articulated in a territorial frame, because that is the frame that seems to be available. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, look, I'm not a magician. I cannot cure the ills of the world, yes? And this is definitely one of the problems that we are facing.